My dad shoved me so hard that my back hit the wall. Before I even understood, he had stood up from the table. His arm was still outstretched, the smell of cheap whiskey clinging to his sleeve. And his voice cracked through the warm air of the kitchen like something breaking. "Ungrateful brat, you need to learn your place." The words did not echo, they landed. Heavy, final, like he had been waiting years to say them out loud. For a second I just stared at him, my shoulder throbbing where the drywall caught me. The plate between us was still warm. Biscuits and chicken I had cooked earlier that evening because that was what he liked on nights when he had lost too much money and needed comfort disguised as food. He looked at me the way someone looks at a cracked glass, annoyed that it failed, annoyed that he now had to deal with it. "You are right, Dad. I will do better." I heard myself say it before I felt myself breathe again. Calm, flat, like surrender spoken through someone else's mouth. His face twitched with satisfaction, the kind that always made me feel smaller, like I was supposed to fold into the wallpaper and take up less space in the house that had never really felt like mine. My dad sat back down like nothing had happened. The chair legs scraped the floor, loud and careless. He took a sip of his drink, a long, slow one that told me he had already forgotten the shove. Or maybe he believed it was something he had the right to do. His eyes did not linger on me. They slid past me the way a man looks past a shadow he does not need to respect. I walked back to the table, my hand pressed lightly against the sore spot on my arm. He did not look. He reached for the salt. The news hummed low on the small television behind him. The overhead light flickered, one of those bulbs I had meant to replace. Everything felt strangely clear, like my brain had decided to stop cushioning reality and let it hit me raw. That was the moment I realized he had not just shoved me. He had pushed me out of existence, out of the story of our family, out of whatever daughter he believed he deserved. The air smelled like fried chicken and stale beer, and under it all was that cold, metallic scent of something ending. Maybe dignity, maybe childhood, maybe the illusion that love from a parent was unconditional. I sat down slowly because standing felt like asking for another blow. He dug into his food with the same hunger he always had after drinking. When he finally looked at me, it was only to say that I should clean the stove when we were done. No please, no thank you. Not any sign that the last 5 minutes had happened. The calm that settled inside me was not peace. It was more like the numbness you feel when a bone snaps. Pain is coming, but not yet. I knew better than to speak again. I chewed my food, though I could not taste it. My mind stepped back, watching everything like a woman watching her own life through a window she could not open. When dinner ended, he left his plate where it was. He walked down the hall, muttering something about needing to check a score. The television in his room clicked on a moment later. I listened to it for a long time, the muffled sound of commentators arguing about a game that meant everything to him and nothing to me. I stayed in the kitchen. The light buzzed overhead. I rested both hands on the edge of the counter and let myself feel the tremble in my fingers. Not fear, recognition. That was the truth that settled in my chest like a stone. I had become something he used. A buffer against loneliness. A wallet with legs. A promise he could guilt into staying. And now, apparently, an object he could knock into walls without remembering 5 seconds later. A daughter turned into a sacrifice. The phrase came to me so quietly, I almost missed it. But once it arrived, it refused to leave. It felt like a line I had heard once in a book or an old sermon. A warning. A prophecy. Maybe a mirror I had tried to avoid for years. My mom had held this house together with nothing but kindness and bone-tired love. After she died, I tried to take her place. Not because he asked, because I thought that was what good daughters did. But the truth was sharper tonight than it had ever been. Mom was the shield, and when she was gone, the blows had nothing left to strike but me. I washed the dishes because that was what I always did. His plate still had a smear of gravy across it. I scraped it into the trash and let the water run hot over my wrists, hoping the heat would steady me. The house was quiet except for the murmur of the television and the ticking of the old clock above the fridge. I remembered Mom standing by that same sink years ago, her shoulders sagging but her smile soft when she turned toward me. She would not have wanted this for me. She would not have wanted me to disappear inside someone else's anger. When the last dish was drying on the rack, I pressed a towel to my cheek. Only then did I feel the sting. A small cut from when my head hit the wall. It was not deep, just enough to mark me. Enough to remind me that tonight was not like the others. The bleeding had already slowed, but the message had not. He did not see me anymore. Or maybe he only saw me when I made his life easier. I leaned on the counter and let the cool surface touch my bruised shoulder. Something inside me, something quiet and long ignored, lifted its head. A thought so soft, it felt like a breath. I do not have to accept this. I turned toward the stove. Tomorrow, morning, breakfast. My mind saw the scene before I understood it. A table set neatly. His favorite biscuits, the flaky kind with butter brushed on top. Eggs fried the way he liked, crisp edges. Sausage browned. The coffee was strong and hot. A morning that looked like peace, but tasted like truth. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady. I wiped the counter, moved slowly, methodically. My hands no longer shook. I poured out the rest of his drink. The bottle clinked when I set it in the trash. He yelled something from down the hall, but I did not answer. The sound did not reach me in the same way anymore. His anger was just noise, and I was done shaping myself around it. Before going to bed, I washed my hands again. The water turned pink for a moment, from the small cut near my cheek. I watched it fade down the drain. When I looked up at my reflection in the dark window above the sink, I did not see fear. I saw a woman who had finally stopped pretending things would get better on their own. Tomorrow morning, I will cook breakfast. I would set the table. I would let him believe he still held all the power he thought he had reclaimed tonight. And then, when everything was quiet and warm and exactly what he expected, I would begin the part he never saw coming. For now, though, the kitchen was still. The house was still. I turned off the light and walked toward my room, my steps soft on the worn floor. The bruise on my shoulder pulsed with each movement, but it felt almost like a reminder of my own body, my own life, my own place, that he could no longer define for me. I closed my bedroom door and let the dark settle around me. The silence did not feel empty. It felt like a beginning. But beginnings have a way of reaching backward before they move forward, pulling old memories up from where you thought you buried them. Lying there on my side, careful not to put weight on my bruised shoulder, I felt the house around me breathe the way it used to when Mom was alive. Soft, warm, held together by someone who believed love could fix anything. I used to believe that too. Mom died in 2012. Cancer. A word people speak softly, even when no one is sleeping. She had been sick for a long time, long enough that the grief started before the funeral. My last clear memory of her was in this same kitchen. She was wiping the counter the way she always did after dinner, her hands moving slowly because the treatments had taken the strength from her arms. She looked at me and smiled, not bright, not forced, just tired and full of something I still cannot name. Maybe it was an apology, maybe hope. Maybe a plea I did not understand back then. After she was gone, it became just me and my dad. No siblings. No extended family who stayed long enough to help. People came by the house for a little while in the first week, dropping off casseroles covered in foil and sympathy written on faces that could not wait to return to their own intact lives. Then the visits stopped. The calls slowed. Quietness settled into the walls. He went back to the coal mine 3 weeks after the funeral. He said he needed to keep his mind busy. I think he needed to outrun the silence. He worked every shift they would give him. He was gone when I left for school and came home only to eat, shower, and fall asleep in his chair with the television flickering in front of him. Grief made him hollow in a way I did not understand. His eyes looked older, as if every blink hurt. But he still tried. He still asked if I had eaten. He still told me to keep my grades up because Mom would want that. Those were the years when he still remembered how to be gentle. The accident happened in 2016, a collapse in one of the lower sections. The kind of thing people who grow up in coal towns whisper about in the same tone they use for storms and funerals. He survived, but his right leg never fully healed, and the doctor said the repetitive strain of the work had pushed his spine past its limit. The company gave him a settlement that sounded big at first, but stretched over years, it was barely enough to keep the lights on. He tried physical therapy for a while, tried odd maintenance jobs, But everything hurt and nothing lasted. By the time I graduated high school, the responsibility of our home had shifted quietly onto my shoulders. It happened so gradually that I did not even realize it until much later. I took the first job I could get, part-time at a grocery store, then at a diner, then finally moved into administrative work at a small logistics company in community Pittsburgh. The pay was not much, but it was steady. I learned to manage bills, groceries, house repairs, and his medications before I learned how to budget for myself. We used to talk more in those early years after his accident. He would sit at the kitchen table while I cooked, telling me stories about the mine, about the men he worked with, about the shifts he hated, and the ones that smelled like hope, because it meant winter would be paid for. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he cried without meaning to. I would pretend not to notice when he wiped his eyes on the sleeve of his shirt. But grief changes shape over time. At first, it looks like sorrow. Then it becomes anger. And if no one deals with it, it hardens into something sharp. He began drinking more. First 1 beer after dinner, then 2, then the sound of cans rolling in the trash long after midnight. The first time I saw him buy a lottery ticket, I thought it was harmless, a tiny dream in a life that had stopped offering many. But soon it was scratch-offs covering the counter, then betting apps on his phone, then nights when he stayed up late watching games he did not even care about, yelling at the television as if losing was a personal attack. When the disability checks came on the first of each month, he would tell me not to worry. He would say he had everything under control, but the truth was in the numbers. Even with my salary padding everything, the money never stretched far enough. I remember once asking him to slow down the spending because we were short on the electric bill. He stared at me like I had insulted him. He raised his voice, saying a man deserved something for himself, that I did not understand what it was like to lose everything. I apologized even though I had done nothing wrong. That was the first time I recall apologizing for existing. Over the years, those apologies grew familiar. They slipped into conversations the way sighs do. Sorry, Dad. Sorry, I did not mean it like that. Sorry, I should have checked sooner. Sorry, I forgot you needed that. Sorry, I am late. Sorry. The strange thing is that I never once stopped to ask why I kept saying it. It was automatic, like breathing, like survival. But he had moments of softness too, moments that kept me from walking away, even when the drinking got worse. There were nights when he would knock on my bedroom door and ask if I wanted to watch an old movie with him. He would fall asleep halfway through, his head tilting back and his snoring rattling softly. And in those moments, he felt more like the dad I remembered, the one who lifted me onto his shoulders at the county fair and told me Mom had the prettiest smile he had ever seen. He was not always cruel. That made it harder. You cannot leave someone when you keep waiting for the better version of them to come back. Still, the house grew smaller around us. The hallways felt tighter. The list of things my dad resented grew longer. My job, my paycheck, my independence. The fact that I still had a future when he had stopped moving. He did not say those things outright, but they lived in the pauses between his words, in the irritated click of his tongue, in the way he would take a comment meant lightly and twist it into something he could be angry about for the rest of the night. I used to sit in my car after work, parked at the curb, trying to gather enough energy to walk inside. Some evenings I watched the sun set behind the row of houses, wondering how many people behind those doors were living lives they never asked for. I never told anyone at work what went on at home. I said my dad was having a hard time. I said he was adjusting to the accident. I said whatever made it sound temporary. But nothing was temporary. It all kept growing. The drinking, the gambling, the resentment. Eventually, the good moments shrank until they barely existed. He no longer thanked me for dinner. He no longer asked how my day was. If anything went wrong, it was my fault. If the mail was late, or the fridge looked empty, or a bill surprised us, he acted like I had failed some unspoken test. I apologize for everything because I did not know how to do anything else. Looking back now, I can see the exact moment when I stopped being a daughter and became something, more like a placeholder. A stand-in, someone who filled space and met needs, but was not truly seen. That moment came on a winter morning a few years ago. I had woken early to shovel the walkway because the snowstorm had hit harder than I expected. He shuffled outside, leaning on the railing. He looked at the cleared path, and instead of thanking me, he asked why I had not done it sooner. I remember feeling something inside me tilt, like the world had shifted a fraction of an inch off-center. I apologized anyway. I told him I would wake earlier next time. He nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. That was when the pattern fully took hold. He pushed, I bent. He complained, I adjusted. He blamed me. I absorbed it. I thought that was just what love looked like after loss. I thought this was what daughters did when life broke their fathers. But lying there the night after he shoved me into the wall, staring into the dark of my room, the truth settled finally and completely. I had spent so many years apologizing for myself that I no longer knew where my own edges were. I had grown used to shrinking, used to walking softly, used to shaping my life around his moods and addictions and grief. I had grown used to apologizing simply for being alive. The realization was quiet, not dramatic. It did not split me open or wring tears from me. It simply arrived, soft as breath, and sat there like it belonged. And as I let it settle, I understood that nothing about tomorrow's breakfast was small. It was not a routine kindness. It was not a hope for peace. It was the first decision I had made entirely for myself in a very long time. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling until the lines blurred. The house was silent, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt like a witness, like it had been waiting for me to see what had been true all along. I closed my eyes and let that truth hold me. Only then did I drift into a restless sleep, knowing morning would come quickly, but for the first time, not fearing it. When I opened my eyes, the room was gray with early light, the kind that seeps in slowly and makes everything look softer than it really is. My shoulder ached when I pushed myself upright. The bruise felt deeper than the skin, like a reminder that last night had not been a dream or a misunderstanding, or one of those moments I used to excuse for the sake of keeping peace. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, letting my breath settle. There was a strange calm inside me, the kind that feels dangerous only because it is so new. I knew I had to get ready for work. My job at the logistics office in Pittsburgh did not offer the kind of flexibility where you could just show up late because your personal life was falling apart. I had already taken too many sick days for things that were not illnesses. Days when he needed to be driven somewhere. Days when he refused to get out of bed without someone coaxing him. Days when the weight of everything kept me from standing upright. I showered quickly, wincing when the water hit the bruise on my back. The cut on my cheek had crusted over. Small, but noticeable. I held my hair so it would fall across that side of my face. I told myself it did not matter. People do not look closely. People do not see unless you make them see. When I walked into the kitchen, he was asleep in his chair, head tilted back, mouth open. The television was still on. Some old reruns played with the volume low. The room smelled like beer and cold chicken. His cane lay on the floor beside him, even though he had not needed it last night when he shoved me. Funny how pain works. It appears when it helps the story you want to tell. I made myself a cup of coffee and drank it standing at the counter. My hands shook a little, not from fear, but from the lack of sleep. I looked at the stove, at the spot where I knew I would be standing tomorrow morning, when everything shifted. That thought steadied me, a quiet line drawn inside myself that no one else could see. By 7, I had slipped out of the house and started the long drive to Pittsburgh. The roads were damp from a light drizzle overnight. The radio stayed off. I needed the silence. Sometimes the quiet between my thoughts felt more honest than anything I said out loud. At work, the fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual. The office smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink. My coworker Megan looked at me when I walked in, her eyes pausing a second too long on the side of my face. She did not say anything right away, just nudged the box of pastries closer to me on the shared desk. "Rough morning," she said softly. I forced a small smile. Long night, nothing new. She nodded, but her eyes did not believe me. She had a way of seeing things people tried to hide. Maybe it came from being raised in a big family. Maybe it came from growing up around women who hid their bruises under long sleeves and kept their secrets in the back of their throats. Our supervisor asked if I could stay late to help with an end-of-month report. My chest tightened. Staying late meant getting home after my dad had already been drinking for hours. Staying late meant facing questions about where I had been, why I had not called, why he had been alone for so long. and honest answers never worked with him. He heard disrespect in the truth and betrayal in logic. I told the supervisor I would try left room for the life I lived outside of this building. Life I never talked about. Around noon, Megan walked over with her salad and sat beside me in the break area. She poked at her lettuce and said she had noticed I had been distracted lately. Then she asked if everything was all right at home. The question hit me harder than I expected. It was the kind of question people ask lightly, but if you answer honestly, the whole world can tilt. I told her I was just tired, that my dad had not been sleeping well, that the house needed repairs and money was tight. All of it is true. None of it is the whole truth. She hesitated, then said if I ever needed someone to talk to, she was around. She told me her aunt had gone through something similar with her own husband, how it had taken years before she finally got out. I could feel my throat tightening. I thanked her, even though I knew I would never tell her everything. Not yet. People in small towns and working-class cities have a particular way of looking at family problems. They say things like, family matters, meaning it should be dealt with quietly. They say things like, he is having a hard time, as if difficulty justifies harm. They say things like, it is not my place to get involved, because involvement means responsibility. And responsibility means change. Most people avoid change until it crashes through their door and refuses to leave. Holidays were the worst. I remember one Thanksgiving when my cousin Caleb stopped by. He brought a pie his mother had baked and sat at the table with my dad while I cooked. Caleb pulled me aside when my dad went to the bathroom and asked if everything was okay. The words were whispered and heavy. I told him the same things I told everyone else. Just stress. Just finances, just life. He nodded, but I could tell he wanted to say more. Then my dad came back into the room, and the moment slipped away like it had never been there. Over the years, my dad's control grew in ways that were not always loud. Sometimes it was the way he questioned every purchase I made, even though my paycheck covered nearly everything. Sometimes it was how he expected me to be home at specific times, asking where I had been even if I was 10 minutes late. Sometimes it was the way he would criticize my clothes, my hair, my cooking, as if everything I did was a test I kept failing. I used to think if I just tried harder, he would soften. That if I earned a little more money, or cooked a little better, or kept the house a little cleaner, he might see me again. Not as the problem, but as his daughter. Hope can be a cruel thing. It slows your leaving long after your spirit knows you should go. Most of the violence in our home was quiet, not physical, more like erosion. Words that scraped away at me slowly. Looks that told me I had disappointed him, even when I had done nothing wrong. Silence that stretched like cold shadows down the hall. The shove at dinner had felt sudden, but the truth was, it had been building for years. A slow climb toward a moment that was always going to happen. When I first started feeling unsafe, I told myself it was in my head, that I was too sensitive, that I was interpreting things the wrong way. But the body knows before the mind is ready. My hands shook when I heard his footsteps. My stomach knotted when I knew he had spent the afternoon betting on games. I learned to predict his moods by the sound of the front door closing. Loud meant danger. Quiet meant guilt. Both meant I needed to move carefully. Isolation crept in quietly. I stopped going out with coworkers. I stopped calling old friends. I avoided family gatherings because I did not want to explain why I was still living with my dad. People in our town judged daughters who stayed too long and daughters who left too soon. Somehow we were always wrong. The shame came next. Not shame about him, shame about me. Shame that I had not built a stronger life. Shame that I did not have the courage to lead. Shame that I kept hoping things would get better when every sign pointed to the opposite. Shame is its own kind of prison. It makes you believe your suffering is deserved. Light snow was falling as I drove home that evening. The sky was a dim gray, the kind of color that feels like an unfinished sentence. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my dad asking where I was. I had only stayed 15 minutes past my shift, but he wanted to know. Always wanted to know. I typed that I was on my way, then deleted it and typed it again with a softer tone. Even my messages were edited to avoid anger. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on. The living room window glowed with the blue light of the television. I sat in the car for a moment, watching my breath fog the windshield. A long time ago, I used to pray before coming inside. Not to any particular God, just to something bigger than me. I asked for patience, for safety, for gentleness. Tonight I did not pray. I did not need to. I already knew something inside me had shifted. My dad did not say much when I walked in. He barely looked up from the game he was watching. His empty beer cans lined the small table beside him. I told him dinner was in the fridge. He grunted. I went to my room, closed the door, and leaned against it until my heartbeat slowed. Then I did something I had never done before. I opened the small notebook I kept in my dresser drawer and wrote down everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The shove, the words, the bruise, the way he looked at me like I was nothing. I wrote it plainly, without emotion. Facts first, feelings later. I knew if I did not write it down, I would eventually convince myself it had not been that bad. That is what people like me do. We negotiate with our own pain until it becomes smaller and more manageable. But I needed the truth to stay sharp. When I put the pen down, I felt a quiet shift inside me, a subtle click, like something locking into place. I closed the notebook, set it beside my bed, and looked around the dim room. Everything looked ordinary. Nothing looked changed. But for the first time, I had more than a thought. I had a record, a line in the sand written in my own handwriting. I knew I would write again tomorrow. That thought stayed with me long after the house went quiet for the night, long after the hallway light clicked off, and his uneven footsteps settled into the rote, slow rhythm of sleep. I lay in bed with the notebook still warm from my hands, the ink drying on a truth I had never allowed myself to name out loud. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not with defiance. More like the earth under me had moved half an inch, enough to change the horizon. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint water stain in the corner, the one he always said he would fix, but never did. Everything felt suspended, as if the whole house were holding its breath. Outside, the late winter wind pressed softly against the siding. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds, familiar ones, but nothing felt familiar anymore. My own skin felt different, like I had stepped out of a version of myself I had worn for too many years. Silence has always been my way of staying safe. Growing up, silence was how I survived Mom's treatments, his shifts, the financial strain that made our entire world feel tight around the edges. Silence meant being a good daughter. Silence meant not adding weight to an already sinking ship. But tonight, silence was not fear. It was not surrender. It was something sharper. It was a strategy. I turned onto my side carefully, wincing when the bruise along my shoulder tugged. The memory of his shove returned in flashes. His voice, his face, the way his eyes slid past me as if I were furniture he had bumped into. I did not feel anger. It surprised me. There was no boiling, no heat, just a stillness that felt older than both of us. I knew that if I confronted him again, if I yelled or cried or demanded an apology, it would only feed the story he had built about himself. A wounded man, a disappointed father, a victim of life's cruelty. He had rehearsed that identity for years until it became armor. If I reacted the way he expected, he would only push harder. If I begged him to stop, he would tell me I was overreacting. If I tried to reason with him, he would twist my words into new accusations. Direct resistance would only fan the flame. And leaving in the middle of the night, while tempting, was impossible. I had nowhere else to go. No savings large enough to rent a place. No one who could take me in without asking the kind of questions I was not yet ready to answer. People always said, just leave, as if leaving were as easy as picking up a bag and closing a door. Leaving is complicated when the person hurting you is also the person you once loved more than anything. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and let the room settle again. There were only 3 choices: endure, flee, or confront the problem through something stronger than emotion. Systems, processes, evidence. I did not know exactly how yet, but the idea felt like a small light inside me, steady and patient. It was the kind of light that did not beg to be seen. It simply existed. Enduring meant more years of walking on tightropes inside my own home, more bruises that could be dismissed, more nights in the car gathering courage before facing him, more apologies I did not owe. My body tightened at the thought. Fleeing meant disappearing, packing a bag, leaving the keys behind, and starting over in some place where no one knew my name. The image was beautiful and terrifying. Freedom always carried a shadow of fear, but I could not leave him alone. Not yet. Not without setting something in motion that protected both of us from each other. Confrontation, at least the kind I understood now, meant stepping out of the emotional war we had been fighting and entering a new terrain. One where silence could collect facts. One where patterns could be recorded. One where the truth could be held up to the light, not as accusation, but as evidence. Silence would not be surrendered. It would be a shield. I closed my eyes and breathed in slowly. The house creaked softly, the way old houses do when the temperature drops. I could almost hear my mom humming in the kitchen, stirring soup or folding towels or doing something simple that made the world feel steady. She never raised her voice at my dad, but she never let him hurt her either. She had boundaries I never learned how to build. Maybe because she had carried the weight of two parents on her shoulders while he drifted in and out of his own grief. For a moment, I imagined what she would say if she were here, sitting at the edge of my bed, smoothing the blanket the way she used to when I had nightmares. I imagined her looking at me with that tired but warm smile she wore at the end of long days. I imagined her telling me to trust myself, that love is not meant to suffocate. That survival is not betrayal. I sat up slowly. The clock on my dresser glowed faintly. A little past midnight. The house was quiet except for the hum of the heater. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, stretching my arms until the tightness in my back eased. My feet padded softly across the cold floor as I walked to the kitchen. The moment I stepped into that room, something inside me tightened into a decision. The overhead light buzzed for a second before flickering on. The kitchen looked the same as it always did, but tonight it felt like a stage. The stove, the counters, the small table where he and I had sat hours earlier, our lives splitting open between us like a fault line. On the counter sat the skillet I had washed after dinner, the one I would use tomorrow morning. I placed my hand on its cool surface and closed my eyes. Breakfast. A simple thing, yet not simple at all. Tomorrow morning would not be an apology. It would not be an attempt at peace. It would be the beginning of a record, a moment of clarity disguised as routine. He expected breakfast when he was hungover or angry or lonely. It made him feel cared for. It made him feel in control. And for years, I had fed that belief because it kept the peace. But tomorrow will be different. Breakfast would not be about him. It would be my line in the sand, my ceremony of recognizing what had happened and what needed to happen next. I opened the fridge and stared inside without really seeing the food. Eggs, butter, sausage, flour for biscuits. All things he liked. All the things I used to cook because it made him easier for a few hours. I touched the carton of eggs lightly, then stepped back. Not tonight. Tomorrow. I walked through the house once more, turning off lights, setting things in order, not because I cared about the house being neat, but because I needed control somewhere. Even if it was small, even if it was temporary. He snored softly in the living room, his head slumped to one side. His face looked older in sleep, softer, even a little helpless. It struck me that this was the man he wanted the world to see. Worn down, broken. Someone's life had chewed through before spitting out. And maybe that was partly true. The mine, the accident, losing Mom, they had carved into him in ways no one could see. But pain does not justify cruelty, and grief does not give anyone permission to hurt the person who stayed. I watched him for a few seconds longer, feeling nothing sharp, nothing hateful, just a quiet distance, the kind you feel when you finally stop pretending someone is who they used to be. I returned to my room and sat at my desk. The notebook was still there where I had left it. I opened it and wrote a single line beneath what I had documented earlier. Tonight I choose silence as my weapon. The pen felt steady in my hand. I reread the sentence, then closed the notebook carefully. It was not fear that filled me now. It was clear, a stillness that felt like the air right before the first snow, when the world holds itself gently, knowing change is coming. I placed the notebook inside the drawer and turned off the lamp. The room fell into darkness again, but I did not feel swallowed by it. Instead, it felt like a waiting room, a space between decision and action. I got back into bed and rested my head on the pillow. The sheets were cool against my skin. My shoulder pulsed with a dull ache, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a marker. Tomorrow morning, I will wake early. I would walk into the kitchen quietly. I would heat the skillet, crack the eggs, and set the table just the way he liked. And while he believed he had regained control, I would begin something he would never see coming. Not revenge, not yet. Something smaller, quieter. The beginning of truth. And that thought carried me gently into sleep. Morning slipped in quietly, the kind of pale light that makes everything look softer than it deserves. I woke before my alarm, my mind already alert, my body heavy but steady. The decision from the night before sat inside me like a small stone in calm water, solid, certain. I lay there for a moment, listening. The house was silent. He had not stirred yet. His snores usually rumbled down the hallway, but today there was only the faint hum of the heater. I pushed myself up slowly, feeling the ache in my shoulder pulse beneath my skin. It did not surprise me anymore. Pain had become familiar, almost predictable. I dressed quietly, choosing a long-sleeve shirt even though the bruise was mostly hidden on my back. My cheek still felt tender where the drywall had scraped it. I brushed my hair over that side of my face without looking in the mirror too long. The kitchen was cold when I stepped inside. I turned on the stove and let the blue flame bloom slowly. I pulled out the pan. The same pan I had touched last night. The same one I had washed after the dinner that had broken something open inside me. My hands moved without rushing. Butter in the skillet. Flour in a bowl, milk, salt. The simple rhythm of making biscuits, something my mom taught me when I was little. Knead gently. Do not overwork the dough. Give it room to rise. The oven warmed the kitchen, and the quiet wrapped around me in a way that felt almost tender. I cracked the eggs into a bowl and whisked them while the biscuits baked. The sausage sizzled on the stove, filling the air with a smell that would always remind me of long mornings and worn-out men who needed comfort more than food. Everything about this morning felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, like each small action was part of something larger than breakfast. I set the table more carefully than I needed to. 2 plates. 2 glasses, forks aligned neatly, a folded cloth napkin instead of the usual paper ones. I even wiped the table a second time, though it was already clean. The whole scene looked unnatural, too arranged, too careful. But that was the point. This was not breakfast. This was the beginning of truth taking its first slow breath. By the time I poured the coffee, I heard my dad stir in the living room. His footsteps were uneven, dragging a little. He was probably hungover. The kind of heavy hangover that made him irritable, quick to judge, quick to snap. But this morning, I felt nothing for it. No dread, no anticipation, just a clear distance. He shuffled into the kitchen wearing the same wrinkled shirt from last night. He smelled like stale beer and bitterness. His eyes were puffy, but when he saw the table set and the food steaming, his whole body shifted. His shoulders pulled back, his chin lifted just a little. A slow smirk tugged at his mouth. He looked at me with the confidence of a man who believed the world had bent itself back in his favor. You finally learned. The words dropped between us like stones, heavy, intentional. A declaration, not an observation. He said it with satisfaction, the kind that comes from believing you have reestablished control. He stood there and let the silence emphasize his victory. I did not answer him. I simply moved toward the stove, turned off the burner, and placed the last dish on the table. I could feel him watching me, waiting for some acknowledgement, some soft confirmation that what he had done last night had worked, that the shove, the words, the humiliation had broken me into obedience. But I kept my face still. Not cold, not angry, just quiet. Calm in a way that unsettled him, even though he did not understand why. Silence had become my weapon, and I could see in his eyes he sensed something different, though he could not name it. He sat down heavily, pulling the plate toward him. He picked up a biscuit and tore into it like a man rewarding himself. Good, I heard him mutter. Real good. He chewed loudly, took a sip of coffee, then cut into the eggs. I sat across from him, folding my hands in my lap. I watched him the way one might watch a stranger, curious but detached. The room felt still, almost too still. The table between us might as well have been a courtroom bench. The plates looked like exhibits. The food looked like evidence. Every detail seemed sharper, more defined. He kept eating, unaware that anything in the world had changed. "You did right by making this," he said finally, as if giving me approval was a privilege. As if last night had never happened. As if my silence belonged to him. I kept my gaze on the table. My heartbeat is steady. My breathing is slow. He reached for the salt, grumbling about the cold weather, the price of groceries, the game he had lost money on the night before. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as he wanted it. Except me. For a moment, his eyes flicked up at my face. He stared as if he expected something to be different there. Maybe he was looking for fear. Maybe guilt. Maybe remorse. But he found nothing familiar. His brow tightened slightly. A small crease. Confusion trying to surface. I finally lifted my gaze and met his eyes for half a second. Not long enough to provoke. Just long enough for him to know I saw him clearly. All of him. The wounded parts, the cruel parts, the parts that pretended helplessness. The parts that hid behind anger. He looked away first. I poured myself a glass of water. Steady hands, slow movements. Each tiny action felt like a pebble placed carefully on a scale. Shifting weight. Evening truth. He cleared his throat and picked up his fork again, but his posture had changed. His shoulders hunched forward slightly, like he felt something he could not explain pressing lightly against him. The biscuits steamed on his plate. The smell filled the kitchen. The clock above the fridge ticked its slow, steady rhythm. He tapped his fork against the edge of the plate, impatient, maybe irritated, maybe unsettled by the quiet he could not claim as his own anymore. I watched him bring a bite to his mouth. Watched him chew, watched him try to return to the smug comfort he had walked in with. He almost succeeded. Then the doorbell rang, a sharp, clear chime that cut straight through the kitchen. He froze, mid-chew. His jaw tightened. His fork hovered an inch above his plate. He looked toward the hallway, confusion spreading across his face. No one came to our house unannounced. No one visited him. No one visited us, not anymore. He swallowed hard, the movement visible along his neck. "Who in the hell is that?" he muttered, voice low, already irritated. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, almost urgent. He pushed back his chair slowly, the legs scraping against the worn linoleum. He stood there for a moment, staring toward the front door like he expected it to explain itself. Then he turned his head toward me, suspicion tightening his features. He opened his mouth to ask me something, but before a word came out, the doorbell chimed the third time, and he finally took a step toward the hallway, the sound of his slipper dragging across the floor louder than it should have been. The doorbell rang again. Not impatient, but firm, like whoever stood outside knew exactly why they were there, and did not intend to leave. He glanced over his shoulder at me, suspicion tightening the corners of his mouth. I kept my eyes on my glass of water, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not need to say anything. Silence had already spoken for me. He cleared his throat and walked toward the front door, muttering under his breath about people who did not know how to call first. I listened to the uneven rhythm of his footsteps. The moment he reached the door, the house seemed to hold itself still, as if even the walls knew something was about to split open. He yanked the door open harder than necessary. His voice came next, rough and irritated. "What do you want?" There was a pause, then a voice I recognized immediately, warm but steady. "Morning, Bill. I figured you might still be home." Mrs. Keating, our neighbor from across the street, 70-something years old, sharp as a blade when she wanted to be, and the kind of woman who noticed everything. She had watched me grow up from her porch swing, always waving when she saw me come home from school. I had not spoken to her much in recent years. Shame isolates. But she had always been kind in small ways, leaving a tin of cookies on our porch every Christmas, even after Mom died. My dad let out a short huff. This really is not a good time. I could almost see her expression in my mind. Polite. Unmoved. "Well, I am here anyway." Another voice joined hers, male, even, and measured. "Sir, good morning. Officer Grant, Pittsburgh Police Community Response. We received a call last night from a neighbor who was concerned about possible distress in the home." My dad's breath caught, sharp and startled. I heard the shift in his tone even before he spoke again. "Nothing happened. Everything is fine. Someone must have misunderstood. There was a moment of quiet that stretched too long to be comfortable. Sir, we are conducting a wellness check. It is routine. The officer's tone did not change, but the firmness underneath it was unmistakable. Someone reported yelling and a loud impact. My dad hesitated. I pictured him standing there, blocking the doorway with his broad shoulders, trying to appear composed. But he had never been good at hiding panic. His voice betrayed him. I said everything is fine. Mrs. Keating spoke again, her tone gentle but unyielding. Bill, I saw her face this morning. She has a mark. I just want to make sure she is all right. My heartbeat slowed as I listened. This moment, this shift, was not mine to force. It had arrived on its own. I had not called anyone. I had not asked for help. But truth has a way of knocking on doors when it is ready to be seen. My dad finally stepped aside. Fine, come in, but this is ridiculous. The footsteps moved from the entryway into the living room, closer and closer until they reached the kitchen doorway. He entered first, his chest tight and red splotches rising along his neck. He looked at me the way someone looks at a fragile object they suddenly realize might break in public. Behind him were Officer Grant and Mrs. Keating. Morning. Officer Grant nodded at me, his expression calm, professional. We would like to speak with you if that is all right. He planted himself between us slightly, his stance widening. There is no need for that. She is fine. She is always fine. He shot me a look that said, play along. I did not move. I did not speak. My silence filled the room like a slow rising tide. Officer Grant stepped a little closer, not aggressive, but steady. Ma'am, are you hurt? His head whipped toward me, eyes narrowing. Answer him. Tell him nothing happened. My throat felt dry, but not from fear. From clarity. I shifted my gaze to the officer and let him see my cheek fully, letting my hair fall back behind my shoulder, the small cut, the faint bruise. The evidence of silence had carried. He stiffened. That was an accident. She bumped into the wall. End of story. Mrs. Keating spoke before the officer could respond. That is not what it sounded like, Bill. He snapped toward her, anger rising. You mind your own business for once. But she did not flinch. Her hand stayed calmly folded over her purse. Her voice never lifted. You made it my business when the yelling lasted 10 minutes. His breathing grew louder, faster, but there was something else creeping into it now. Fear. He looked at me again. But this time his eyes were searching, almost pleading. Tell them. He wanted me to save him the way I always had, to smooth it over, to make it disappear. But I said nothing. Officer Grant took a slow breath. Sir, please step back. I need to speak with her. His jaw clenched. This is my house, and she is a resident within it. The officer's tone stayed even. I need to ensure she is safe. He stepped back an inch, then another. It was small, barely noticeable, but the room shifted with it. The kitchen was no longer his territory. He no longer owned the silence. Officer Grant moved closer and lowered his voice. Ma'am, I need to ask if you feel unsafe at this moment. I looked directly at him. The words did not need to be loud. They only needed to be true. Yes, I feel unsafe. He flinched like I had slapped him. For a moment, he just stared, stunned, as if he could not comprehend that the story he had been writing for years was no longer his to control. I felt him watching the officer's reaction, trying to guess how bad this would get for him. Panic flickered behind his eyes. He started to reach out toward me, maybe to grab my arm, maybe to show something like remorse. But Officer Grant stepped between us cleanly, blocking his hand. Sir, do not make contact with her. His arm fell heavy to his side. He looked around the room, his gaze darting from the set table to the steaming plates of food to the spotless counters. He was searching for some explanation, some place to stand, some way to regain ground. But breakfast had turned into something else, a witness stand, a quiet courtroom. And the system had just entered the room. Officer Grant glanced at the table. Did you prepare this today? I nodded once. He barked out a laugh, brittle and desperate. She cooks for me all the time. She is fine. You people are overreacting." He threw his arm out wildly, gesturing at the kitchen. "This is family. Families argue. Families bump into walls." Mrs. Keating stepped forward, her eyes sharp but sad. "Bill, families do not bruise each other." His face hardened, then cracked. He looked older suddenly, smaller, as if the weight of everything he had ignored for years was finally catching up to him. But he forced his voice steady. "You." He pointed at me. "You would ruin everything over one stupid night." I held his gaze without blinking. For the first time in years, I did not shrink. I did not lower my eyes. I simply let him see the truth. I did not need to argue. The room spoke for me. Officer Grant turned toward him fully. "Sir, at this time, based on visible injury and reported disturbance, we need to separate you both temporarily. You may remain in the living room while I continue speaking with her." He sputtered, his face turning red. "You cannot do that. You cannot make me leave my own kitchen." The officer did not raise his voice. He did not move aggressively. He simply stood straight, his authority filling the room the way a slow, spreading shadow does. "Sir, step into the living room now." He froze, not because the words were loud, but because they were final. Something inside him understood. He was no longer the most powerful man in the room. His anger collapsed inward. His shoulders slumped. His mouth opened as if to argue again, then closed. He took one step backward, then another, until he was standing at the threshold of the kitchen, his hand gripping the doorway like he needed it to hold himself up. He looked at me one last time, eyes wide, voice small and hoarse. "You did this." I stayed silent. Officer Grant waited. My dad took 2 more steps into the living room, and in that moment, as he crossed out of the kitchen, I felt the shift as clearly as if the floor had moved beneath us. He had lost control of the space. Not because I fought him, not because I yelled or demanded justice, but because truth had walked through the front door and sat down at the table he once believed belonged only to him. And for the first time in a very long time, the house no longer answered to him. He stood in the living room doorway like a man caught between 2 worlds. Behind him, the kitchen still smelled like sausage and biscuits, the warmth of breakfast rising into the air. But in front of him stood the officer who would not move aside, a man who would not offer comfort or excuses, or let him hide behind the walls he had built for years. The house felt split in half. One side is his past, one side the truth. Officer Grant did not push him or raise his voice. That was what made the moment so sharp. His calmness filled the space with something stronger than anger. Authority, unshakable and plain. "Sir, I need you to stay seated. This is for everyone's safety." He let out a rough sound that started like a laugh, but broke in the middle. His chest rose and fell too fast. He wiped his palms on his jeans as if trying to brush away the fear gathering there. "Safety. This is my house. I decide what happens here." Mrs. Keating stood behind the officer, near the edge of the kitchen table. Her posture was steady, her expression calm. She was not there to argue. She was there to witness. The kind of witness my dad never expected. The kind who did not flinch or get intimidated or pretend not to hear what was happening. The officer's voice stayed level. "Please sit." My dad looked around the room like he was searching for proof that this could not be happening. His gaze landed on me. He waited for me to fix it, waiting for the daughter who always smoothed everything over, the daughter who folded herself into silence whenever he needed to feel powerful. But I stayed where I was. He sat slowly, each inch of movement stiff, reluctant. His back sank into the couch, his breath shallow. He said again, softer this time, like he was trying to convince himself. "Families fight. Families yell. She knows that." Officer Grant nodded once but did not agree. "Sir, we are going to continue the welfare check now." His eyes darted toward the door, toward me, toward the window. He looked cornered. The living room that had always been his territory no longer answered to him. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Officer Grant stepped slightly toward me. "Ma'am, are you able to answer a few questions?" He leaned forward so quickly the couch creaked. "She is fine. She was clumsy last night. End of story." The officer glanced at him. Sir, let her speak. He froze like someone had placed a hand on the center of his chest. His mouth opened, then shut again. He fell back into the couch with an exhale that sounded more like defeat than anger. Officer Grant returned his focus to me. Did he physically harm you last night? My heart thudded once, heavy but steady. I kept my eyes on the officer. Yes, he shot upright. That is a lie. You bumped into the wall. You told me you did. You said it was nothing. He looked at the officer again, frantic. She twists things. She always has. I could hear the fear behind his words. Not fear of what he had done, but fear of losing the story he thought he controlled. Officer Grant's tone remained calm. Did he shove you? Yes. His face crumpled into something I had never seen before. Shock, betrayal, panic. He looked at me like I was someone he no longer recognized. Why would you say that? Why would you do this to me? I lifted my chin a fraction. I am telling the truth. The words were simple, quiet, but they drew a line straight through the room. He rubbed both hands over his face, pulling down on his skin like he wanted to erase his own expression. You people do not understand. This is normal. Families argue. Families bump into things. This is a misunderstanding. Mrs. Keating stepped forward then, her voice steady. Bill, arguments do not leave cuts on faces. My dad turned on her with disbelief. You do not know what goes on in here. You have no right to be involved. She did not blink. I have ears, and I have eyes. He swung his gaze back to the officer. I want her gone. She will twist everything. She has always been too emotional. I watched him, listening to the same excuses he had used for years. Every sentence he spoke was a shield built from denial. But the shields no longer held. Officer Grant stepped closer to him. Sir, based on visible injuries and reported disturbance, we are going to proceed with a temporary separation for safety. His face was drained of color. Separation? For what? This is my home, the officer continued. This is part of our domestic safety procedure. You will be asked to step outside with me while she remains here. After that, further instructions will be given. He looked like he might choke on his own breath. You cannot make me leave. The officer spoke without raising his voice. Sir, you can either step outside voluntarily, or I will escort you. Those are the options available at this time. I could almost see the moment the words landed. His shoulders twitched, then sagged. His body seemed to collapse inward. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. Smaller. The kind of small that comes from losing something invisible and precious. His sense of authority. His certainty that he could twist the narrative. His belief that he owned the home and everyone inside it. The officer waited. His breathing grew shallow and loud. He shook his head slowly, then faster, as if trying to shake the reality off his skin. This is my daughter. We do not need the police involved, she promised. She said she would take care of me. I worked all my life. I sacrificed everything for her. She owes me that. The words were thrown like accusations, but they were really pleasurable. I spoke softly, but each word was steady. I do not feel safe with you here. He froze. It was not loud. It was the finale. He blinked as if he did not understand the language I was speaking. Then his mouth moved soundlessly, trying to form an argument he could no longer hold together. Officer Grant gestured gently. Sir, please stand. He pushed himself up with stiff arms, his movements jerky. He did not look at me now. His eyes were fixed on the floor. He muttered something that sounded like everything was falling apart, but it was too. Soft, to be certain. He took a step toward the hall. His posture was crooked, leaning too much on his injured leg. For years, I had been the one to steady him. Today I stood still and let the officer take the place I used to fill. As they reached the doorway, he paused beside the kitchen table. His eyes landed on the plate he had eaten from. The crumbs of the breakfast he believed proved his control. Something flickered across his face. Confusion. Maybe regret. But it dissolved quickly, swallowed by humiliation. He spoke without looking at me. You think this makes you strong. You think involving strangers will fix anything, I replied quietly. I think telling the truth is the first step. He flinched like the words were physical. He shuddered once, an involuntary tremor. Then he moved again, following the officer through the living room toward the front door. The air from outside swept into the house for a brief moment. Cold. Clear. Not like the heavy, stale heaviness that usually clung to the living room. I stepped forward just far enough to see through the doorway. He stood beside the patrol car, one hand gripping the roof, breathing hard. Officer Grant talked to him calmly. I could not hear the words, but the tone held no judgment, only procedure. A second officer had arrived and was speaking to neighbors who had come out onto the state, their porches. People watched quietly. Their faces carried a mix of curiosity and concern. He noticed them. His shoulders curled inward. His chin dropped. He seemed to fold into himself. His reputation, the one he carried like a badge in this neighborhood of tired houses and worn down pride, was unraveling in the open. When the back door of the car opened, my dad hesitated. Not resisting, just stunned. He lowered himself into the seat, his hands trembling as he steadied himself. Officer Grant spoke briefly, closed the door, and then got into the front. The patrol car pulled away slowly, turning the corner until the sound of it faded. Inside the house, the silence was unlike any silence I had ever known here. Not oppressive, not fearful, not hollow. Just still. I closed the front door gently and let my back rest against it. My hands were warm. My breathing was slow. The room felt larger, as if the walls had expanded to make space for something new. Not victory. Not relief, just the truth. He was gone. Not forever, not yet, but for the first time in my life, the house was no longer his to command. And I stood in the middle of it, steady on my own feet, waiting for whatever came next. The front door clicked shut behind me, and for a long moment I did not move. The house felt different in a way I could not name at first. Bigger, somehow. Still in a way that felt unnatural. The air no longer carried the heaviness of someone waiting to explode. It was just quiet. Honest quiet. A kind I had not heard in years. I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, listening to the silence settle around me like dust after a storm. He was gone. Not permanently, but gone long enough for the officer's words to echo in the empty space he left behind. Temporary separation. Mandatory assessment, safety protocol. Words I had only heard in passing, never imagining they would apply to us. But life draws lines in places you do not expect. Slowly, I walked into the living room. His imprint was still in the couch cushion, the fabric dented where he sat moments earlier. An empty beer can lay on its side under the coffee table. His cane leaned awkwardly against the wall, as if confused about its purpose now. I picked it up and set it gently beside the table, then stepped back and stared at it. It looked out of place. Or maybe I was seeing it differently for the first time. I went to the kitchen next. The breakfast plates sat untouched on my side of the table, half eaten on his. The steam had faded, leaving a faint smell of butter and sausage in the air. I collected the dishes one by one, rinsing them under warm water, listening to the sound of it hitting the sink. Routine movements, familiar ones, but today they felt heavier. Not sad, not triumphant, just necessary. A knock at the door startled me. Not loud, not urgent. When I opened it, a woman stood on the porch, her clipboard tucked under her arm. She had kind eyes, but a posture that told me she spent her days walking into homes, full of complicated stories. Good morning. I am Denise Carter from Pittsburgh County Social Services. I am here following up on the welfare check. I stepped aside and let her in. She scanned the room lightly, not judging, just observing. She introduced herself formally, then asked if I felt comfortable talking. I nodded. She sat at the kitchen table, smoothing the edge of her jacket. Her voice was gentle but steady. We will be recommending temporary protective separation and mandatory addiction evaluation for your father. Based on the officer's report and what was observed, it is appropriate. The words felt surreal. I folded my hands together so she would not see them tighten. What happens now? He will begin with a 72-hour evaluation. After that, depending on his condition, he may be placed in an inpatient rehab program. This is not punishment. It is an intervention. Her tone left no room for shame. She continued, during this time, he will not be allowed to contact you. No contact. Those words landed differently than I expected. I thought they would bring relief, maybe even satisfaction. But instead there was a hollow space beneath them, something like disbelief wrapped in exhaustion. She asked me a few more questions. Whether I had support, whether I had a safe place to stay if needed, whether I wanted counseling resources. I answered politely, though I was not sure how much I processed. When she left, she placed her card on the table and told me to call if anything changed. After she was gone, I sat down in the same chair I had been sitting in that morning. The house felt even quieter now. I could hear the refrigerator humming. The clock is ticking. My own breath moving in and out, like something borrowed. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Officer Grant. He explained the protective order in simple, clear language. 30 days minimum. My dad could not come near the house. He could not call. He could not ask someone else to contact me on his behalf. He needed to complete the initial assessment before any further decisions were made. He also told me something I did not expect. Your neighbor, the older lady who came by, provided a statement. It was supportive, helpful. I thanked him. After the call ended, I stared at the phone in my hand for a long moment. The idea that someone had watched me struggle quietly for years and finally stepped in felt like both kindness and sorrow. I wondered how much she had heard over time, how much she had pieced together, how long she had waited for a moment like this to make sure doing the right thing would not cause me greater harm. The next day, I received another update. He had been admitted to a rehab facility just outside Pittsburgh for alcohol and gambling addiction. He would remain there for a minimum of 2 weeks, depending on his evaluation. A judge had signed the protective order, grant me legal separation and control of household decisions until further notice. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the envelope that contained the paperwork. My name at the top, his name beneath it. The words, legal protection, in simple print. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt administrative, clean, almost emotionless. Karma does not always arrive loud. Sometimes it comes in offices and envelopes and signatures. Sometimes it does not scream. It just moves quietly and leaves the consequences sitting on your kitchen table. Over the next week, the house shifted in ways I did not expect. The air felt lighter. The mornings felt calmer. I brewed coffee without waiting for footsteps behind me. I ate without having to shape myself around someone else's moods. I came home from work without feeling the familiar knot in my stomach. But the quiet was not kindness. It was unfamiliar. It felt like a room I knew, but had never stepped into. People at work noticed a difference. Megan asked how things were going, her voice careful. I told her the truth, or at least a version of it, that he was getting help. Things were changing at home. She nodded, her eyes soft in a way that made me look away. I did not want sympathy. I did not know what to do with it. The rehab facility sent updates. He was participating in group sessions. He was struggling with withdrawal. He had outbursts. He apologized, then retracted the apology hours later. Additionally, has a way of unraveling people until all that is left is the part of them they never wanted others to see. I read the updates, then placed them in a drawer. I did not feel the need to respond to them. They were not mine to carry. I went through mail he used to open. Bills, notices, things he ignored until they piled up. I called the electric company, the loan office, the pharmacy. I updated accounts and arranged payment plans. As I worked through each task, I realized how much of our life had rested on my back for years. Even when he believed he held control. He had never managed the house. He had managed me. One evening, I found myself standing in the hallway staring at his bedroom door. The room was dim. His clothes still hung in the closet. His boots were still beside the bed. Everything untouched. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the mattress. The smell of his aftershave lingered faintly in the air. For a moment, I closed my eyes and tried to remember the dad he had been before everything went wrong. Before the mine, before drinking, before grief hardened him into someone who did not recognize the harm he caused. I could not pinpoint the moment he shifted, or the moment I stopped asking him to shift back. But sitting there, I finally allowed myself to feel something I had avoided for years. Sadness. Deep, quiet sadness. Not for losing him, but for never having the chance to be his daughter without becoming his shield. When I left the room, I closed the door softly behind me. I did not lock it. I did not pretend it no longer existed. I just let it stay closed, for now. A week passed, then another. The house did not fight me. It did not argue. It did not demand anything. But the silence grew heavier each night. Not threatening, just thick with memory. I would walk into the living room and see the indentation in the couch where he used to sit. I washed dishes and felt myself glance up, expecting him to come in with a complaint or a demand. Old habits do not leave quickly, even when the source of them is gone. One night after work, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The clock ticked softly. Outside, a light snow began to fall, drifting past the porch light in slow spirals, the kind of quiet snowfall that feels like a pause between chapters. I let the warmth of the mug rest in my hands and breathed in slowly. This was the part no one prepares you for. Not the confrontation, not the intervention, not the separation, but the stillness that comes afterward. The space where revenge does not feel like triumph and justice does not feel like victory. The space where your world is suddenly yours again and you do not know what to do with it. I leaned back in the chair and let my gaze drift across the empty room. For so long, this house had echoed with noise. His voice, his anger, his disappointment. Now it held something else. A strange mix of freedom and loss, hire and sorrow, peace and emptiness. Karma had not arrived with flames or shouting or dramatic punishment. It had walked in quietly, wearing a badge and carrying paperwork. It had taken him gently by the arm. It spoke calmly. It gave me space instead of satisfaction. And now, for the first time in my life, I sat alone in a quiet house and did not know what came next. The snow outside kept falling in slow drifting patterns, settling softly against the windows. And for a long time I sat there in the kitchen with my cooling cup of tea, unsure what to do with the silence that pressed gently around me. I had never known this house without his footsteps cutting through the walls, without the sound of him shifting in his chair or calling my name, or muttering curses at the television. Now the quiet felt heavy in a different way, like standing in a room after a long storm and realizing the wind had finally stopped. Eventually I stood, rinsed out the mug, and wiped the counter, just to have something to do with my hands. The simple act grounded me. I knew the next steps would not be dramatic or quick. They would be small movements at first, ordinary chores that slowly built into something resembling a life made by my own choices. The first thing I did the next morning was change the locks. A young locksmith from a local company came in a snow-covered truck, stomping the slush off his boots before stepping inside. He worked with quick, efficient movements, replacing the deadbolt and the knob, explaining the new key system in a friendly way. I nodded, listening carefully, though a part of me felt distant, almost dazed. When he handed me the small set of new keys, cold metal resting in my palm, the gesture felt symbolic in a way he could never fully understand. Once he left, I held the keys tightly for a moment, breathing slowly. My hands did not shake. After that, I began picking through the house, room by room, not to erase him, but to clear space I had not touched in years. I gathered old beer cans from under the coffee table. I folded blankets that had been tossed across chairs. I emptied ashtrays he had insisted on keeping, even though he quit smoking years ago. The living room began to change shape as I moved through it, becoming less cluttered, less heavy. In the hallway, I paused outside his bedroom door. I had only stepped inside once since he left. Today I opened it again, letting the light spill inside. The bed was still unmade. His work boots, dusty and frayed, rested beside the dresser. The shirt he had worn on the day of the accident hung crookedly on a hanger. I touched the sleeve lightly with my fingertips, feeling the worn fabric under my skin. He had so many things in this room. Strong, broken, angry, lost. A father, a stranger, a man I tried to save. A man who did not know how to save himself. I gathered the clothes scattered on the floor and folded them neatly, setting them on the bed. It was not an act of forgiveness or attachment. It was simply an act of recognition of who he had been, who he no longer was. Later in the afternoon, I drove into Pittsburgh for my first counseling session. The parking lot outside the clinic was half covered in slush. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon disinfectant. A soft instrumental track played in the background, the kind you barely hear, but feel settling into your shoulders. My therapist, a woman named Janine, invited me to sit on a couch near the window. Her voice was gentle, but not fragile. She listened without interrupting as I spoke through the events of the last week, my words coming out in slow, measured steps. Sometimes I paused to breathe. Sometimes I sat in silence, letting the reality settle. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. Choosing yourself is often the hardest thing a person can do. It costs something, sometimes more than you expect. I felt tears burn behind my eyes, though none fell. I knew she was right. Choosing myself had cost me the idea of him I once carried, the idea of family I had tried to preserve, the idea that love alone could repair the broken parts of a person. When I left the clinic an hour later, the snow had stopped. The sky was a muted gray, soft and open. I walked to my car slowly, breathing the cold air deep into my lungs. Everything felt unfamiliar, but familiar enough that I knew I could handle it. That evening, back at home, a white envelope had slipped through the mail slot. There was no return address. I knew immediately who it was from. I picked it up and sat on the couch before opening it. Inside was a folded sheet of lined notebook paper. His handwriting was shaky, uneven. I read each line carefully. He did not beg me to take him home. He did not demand anything. He did not blame me. The letter was short, almost startlingly so. He wrote that the evaluation had been difficult, that he was angry. That anger made him tired. He wrote that he missed the house. Not me specifically, just the house. The routine, the familiar walls. He wrote about the rehab program, how they were making him attend daily meetings, how he did not think any of it would help, but he was going along with it because there was nothing else to do. Near the bottom of the letter, he wrote one sentence that stayed with me long after. I folded the paper back up. I do not know who I am without you telling me what is real. I stared at the handwriting, the way the ink pressed too hard into the paper. There was truth in the sentence, painful and misplaced, but it was not mine to carry anymore. I tucked the letter into a drawer without responding. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Healing requires distance, and for the first time in my life, I had the distance to see him clearly. Over the next few days, I continued to adjust the house. I washed the curtains. I rearranged the pantry. I repaired a loose hinge on a cabinet door. Every small change felt like reclaiming inches of space I once surrendered without realizing. I could breathe differently in those rooms now. The air no longer belonged to someone else. One night, after cleaning the kitchen, I took out the trash and walked to the edge of the driveway. The neighborhood was quiet. A few porch lights were on, glowing in soft halos through the cold air. I could see the faint outline of Mrs. Keating sitting on her porch swing, wrapped in the blanket, watching the world with her steady gaze. She lifted her hand in a small wave. I waved back. "Thank you," I said softly into the cold night, though she could not hear me. When I went back inside, I turned off the lights one by one. The house grew dimmer, then darker, until only the lamp beside my bed was left glowing. For years I had slept lightly, always listening for footsteps, for slammed doors, for sudden anger. Sleep had been something I approached carefully, like stepping into water that might be too cold or too deep. I could never let myself fall fully into it. But that night, when I slid under the blankets, something felt different. The room was dark, but it was not threatening. The quiet was full, but not heavy. My breathing softened. My shoulders loosened. The knot in my stomach that had lived there for years seemed to dissolve. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I lay down without bracing myself for interruption. I closed my eyes, listening to the gentle hum of the heater, the faint rustle of tree branches against the siding. I let myself sink into the mattress, letting the weight of my body settle without fear of consequence. The silence wrapped around me like a warm quilt, and that night, in a house that had witnessed years of tension and survival, I finally slept. Not lightly, not anxiously, fully, deeply, safely, for the first time. For a long moment after waking the next morning, I did not move. The room was warm, lit only by the faint stripe of sunlight squeezing through the blinds. I lay there feeling the weight of sleep still clinging to me, the good kind. The kind that leaves your chest open instead of tight. It took me a second to remember why this morning felt different. Then it came back in a slow, quiet wave. I had slept, fully, 8 or 9 hours, maybe more. No jolting awake, no listening for footsteps, no dread curled in my ribs. 6 months earlier, that would have felt impossible. I pushed myself up, rubbing my eyes, and looked around my bedroom. The walls were the same soft beige. The dresser was the same one I had used since college, but something in the air had changed. Not because the house was different, but because I was. Life did not transform overnight. It unfolded gradually, piece by piece, like a long winter finally starting to thaw. The first month after my dad was sent to rehab was the hardest, not because he was gone, but because of what his absence revealed. Habits I had built my entire life had nowhere to go anymore. I would catch myself listening for him, or rehearsing excuses in my mind before, remembering I no longer needed them. My body moved through rooms carefully, anticipating reactions that were no longer coming. That kind of unlearning takes time. I kept going to therapy. Every week, Janine helped me untangle the fear and loyalty that had been woven together inside me for so long, they almost looked like the same thread. I told her about the sadness I felt even after finally standing up for myself. She told me that sorrow does not mean regret. It means I am human. She was right. My dad remained in the rehab facility for nearly 3 months. The judge extended the protective order during that time, and part of me expected he would fight it, rage against it, and call it unfair. But he did not. If he tried, the system did not relay it to me. Instead, at the end of the 3rd month, I received a short letter. His handwriting was steadier this time, though still uneven. I am sober. I am working on it. I understand you need space. That was all it said. No attempt to manipulate, no self-pity, no pretending nothing happened. Not an apology either. Not exactly, but something closer to humility than I had ever seen from him. I did not write back. Not then. I let the letter sit on my nightstand for a few days, reading it once or twice before sliding it into a drawer. It was not forgiveness. It was not rejection. It was simply space, something both of us needed more than either of us had admitted. He rented a small apartment on the other side of town after being discharged, a place near the river, close to grocery stores and bus lines, chosen with help from the social worker assigned to him. I knew these details because the program mailed me updates. Not invasive ones, just enough to keep me aware without drawing me back into his day-to-day life. Occasionally, I would run into someone in town who knew him from the mining days, and they would mention seeing him around. That he looked tired but clearer, that he was attending meetings regularly, that he had cut down on cigarettes and picked up fishing again. I would nod politely and thank them for telling me. Each time, the news felt distant, like hearing about a cousin you used to be close with but had not spoken to in years. During those months, I rebuilt my own routines slowly. I went back to working normal shifts at the insurance office in town. I made dinner when I felt like cooking, and ordered takeout when I did not. I learned how to sit on the couch and relax without waiting for someone to barge in or complain about the television volume. I reconnected with friends I had unintentionally drifted away from because most of my energy for years had been pulled into surviving home life. I even bought new curtains for the living room, a pale blue pair that let morning light spill through gently. They were small changes, but they felt like declarations. This is my home now. This is my life now. One Saturday afternoon in early fall, I drove out to a lake about an hour outside Porterville. I brought a sandwich and a worn paperback that had been collecting dust on my shelf. I sat at the edge of the water, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the sun warm my face. A few families were fishing nearby. A couple walked past with their dog. Someone laughed behind me. The world felt soft and wide. Months earlier, I could not have imagined sitting alone in such quiet without feeling fear or guilt. But that afternoon, I felt something else entirely. Presence. A sense that my life finally belonged to me. 2 weeks after that trip, I got another letter from my dad. This one was longer. He wrote about the rehab classes he had taken, how difficult it was to face the parts of himself he had ignored for years. He wrote about Mom, saying he was sorry for the weight he had placed on me after losing her. He wrote that he understood if I chose not to have a relationship with him moving forward. He ended with a sentence that surprised me. I know now that loving someone does not give you ownership of them. I held the letter carefully, reading that line over and over. There was a time when seeing those words would have broken me open. Now they landed differently. Not as a wound, as an acknowledgement. A truth spoken plainly instead of violently. I still did not write back. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Some things do not need immediate answers. Some wounds take time to heal, even when the bleeding has stopped. I continued attending therapy and building routines that made me feel grounded. I started attending a yoga class twice a week on the recommendation of my therapist. The first time I went, I felt awkward and stiff, embarrassed by how clumsy I was. But by the 5th or 6th class, I found myself breathing easier. My balance improved. My chest felt lighter. My shoulders settled lower than I thought they could. About 6 months after the morning everything changed, I received a message from my dad's caseworker asking if I would be willing to meet with him in a neutral setting. There was no pressure, only an option. I sat with the message for 2 days before deciding. I agreed. We met at a small community center with a glass wall facing the river. He walked in slowly, thinner than before, his hair more gray than I remembered, but his eyes were clearer. He sat across from me with his hands folded tightly, like he was afraid they might shake. He apologized for what he had done, not dramatically, not with excuses, plainly, quietly. He said he understood if I could not forgive him. He said he was trying to be someone he could live with, even if he never earned the right to be in my life again. As he spoke, I listened, not as a daughter hoping to fix him, not as someone waiting for him to fail, as a person hearing another person take responsibility for the first time. When he finished, I told him the truth. I told him I hoped he stayed sober. I told him I hoped he found peace. But I also told him I could not go back to the way things were, that I had boundaries now, that my life had shape for the first time in years, and that any future between us would have to respect that shape. He nodded. Slowly, respectfully, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt his breathing without fear hidden behind it. We parted without promises. No dramatic reconciliation, no tearful embrace. Just two people acknowledging the cost of the journey that brought us here. A few weeks later, on a cool evening in late November, I stood in my living room looking at the soft blue curtains glowing in the middle, lamplight. The house was quiet again, but this time, the quiet felt warm, steady, full. I wrapped myself in a blanket, sat on the couch, and listened to the wind brushing against the siding. My life was not perfect. It was not simple, but it was mine, fully. Silence had not ruined me. It saved me. Justice had not been loud, but it had been completed. I leaned back against the cushions, letting a long, slow breath fill my lungs and release gently. And in that moment, I understood something I had never known to put into words. Choosing myself had never been a punishment for him. It was a salvation for me. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.